All Things Data podcast. In the spirit of Daniel Kahneman, Peter Diamandis, and Google Moonshots, brings together leading data scientists, technologists, business model experts, and futurists to discuss how to utilize, harness, and deploy data science and data-driven strategies to enable digital transformation. The hosts are Dr. Manjeet Rege, Associate Professor of Data Science, and Dan Yarmoluk, Director of Business Development of IoT and Data Science. The podcast is produced by the Graduate Programs of Software of the University of St. Thomas in St. Paul, Minnesota.
You're listening to the All Things Data podcast. My name is Manjeet Rege. So this is a show on which we talk about everything related to data. And I'm joined by my co-host, Dan Yarmoluk. Hi, Dan.
How you doing, Manjeet? Great to be here. And I also have one of my colleagues I dragged into this, Mr. Craig Trumpy, who is our Director of Reliability in Industrial IoT with decades of experience in process and reliability in the Midwest markets.
Hello, everybody. Glad to be here.
So we're going to kick it off with our guest is Mr. Nagaraj Srinivasan, who's the Senior Vice President of the Landmark and Halliburton Digital Solutions Division. He is currently responsible for Landmark, Halliburton's commercial software business, and also oversees Halliburton's digital efforts. Previously, he served as Vice President of the Landmark product service line, and he joined Halliburton in 2011 following a 17-year career with Oracle, where he last served as Vice President of Supply Chain Products. He has extensive experience in all aspects of enterprise software across various vertical markets, and holds several patents in technology. He also serves on the advisory board for the Master of Science in Analytics at Texas A&M University. He holds a Bachelor of Technology from the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras and a Master of Science from the University of California in Berkeley and an MBA from the University of California in Los Angeles. Welcome, Nagaraj.
It's a real pleasure to be on, Dan. Thanks again for having me on the show, and glad to be with you guys, Manjeet and Craig.
So Nagaraj, let me begin asking, just so that our listeners get familiar, the size and scope of Halliburton, Landmark as well, and as well as the size and scope and the types of data that you guys are dealing with for operations and forecasting, for example.
First of all, Halliburton's close to a 100-year-old company. We were first founded in 1919, and it started off with the cementing of oil wells. So that's where we started. That's what our founder, Earl P. Halliburton, started doing. And then over the last 100 years, we are covering pretty much all aspects of the life cycle of oil fields, which means constructing oil and gas wells and then completing them, producing them, and all aspects associated with that. In 1997, Landmark was acquired by Halliburton. Landmark has a very rich history in the software space in E&P, that is exploration and production, and was the very first company to use the nascent personal computing technologies for the activity of seismic interpretation. So prior to the advent of personal computing, a lot of the interpretation of geology and geophysics was done by hand. So people used crayons and paper and pencil to do that, and personal computing pretty much revolutionized that, and Landmark was the first entity to bring that innovation and breakthrough to fore. And in the last 35 years plus, Landmark has essentially expanded its purview of all aspects of exploration, reservoir development, economics, drilling, production, abandonment, and all of the infrastructural components of data management, analysis, synthesis, and insights from that. So that's what we do. Halliburton's about 70,000 employees or so with global operations, and clearly our primary customers are the operators, the super majors, the independents across the globe. A lot of this is about dealing with different sets of data types. So when you think of the data types involved, it's primarily seismic. It could be 2D, 3D seismic. It could be well logs, which you can think of as signal processing related data. There's real-time data when you're drilling a well, when you're completing a well, when you're producing from a well. There's a lot of fiber optic related information coming from core acoustic and temperatures and pressures and things of that nature. And then of course there's the particular data around the enterprise data, like order to cash, procure to pay processes, project related processes. And when you put them all together, not only do you have a rich variety of data, but you also have data that has a different traceability, different chronology, a different situation in the overall life cycle. Analysis of each of these individual streams, as well as the synthesis of that into a bigger picture, is essentially the challenge of the industry and the challenge of every company dealing with that.
I was listening to your keynote talk, the Life 2017 conference. So there you spoke about the fact that Halliburton has done a lot of advancement and mainly in terms of making the oil field business smarter. Can you speak a little bit about that?
That's a great question. When you think back to historically how the oil field sector has worked, it's about taking equipment, which I'll call quote unquote dumb. So which means it's basic hardware, mechanical, electrical equipment and out to the field. And then you use it to undertake a particular activity or a process. And over time, that's been augmented with sensors and some capabilities to acquire some stimuli. So whether they be about the rock or about the operations themselves. And very often the intelligence on interpreting that data has come from the human intellect. So when you think about the people interpreting that data and then using that to make decisions, that's been quite manual, quite laborious, and which means by definition, highly latent as well as error prone. And over time, that transition from that completely manual to semi-automated to completely automated is starting to occur. Halliburton's on the forefront of trying to push it towards more and more automation, whereby there is a clear understanding of the basic mechanics of data acquisition, synthesis, and assimilation, coupled with the aspect of modeling around that data, to all the way to high-level interpretation of the data, which is more of an art form than it is a science. So filling that continuum quite fully is what we mean by smart, and that's what we are endeavoring to do.
Nagaraj, we talked before, but for purposes of the listeners, there was that McKinsey study that's saying, an oil rig with 30,000 sensors only uses 1% of that data. Can you contextualize, your response to that statement and when we're talking about being smarter and actionable data, what you're concerned with, in the day-to-day?
There's been a lot of debate in the industry, as we talked about, Dan, on that 1%, whether that, first of all, is true or not, and second, if that's a problem or not. And I certainly believe that there is some truth to that number, and we can argue whether it's 1% or 3%. It's fair to say that just a small portion of the data is utilized and analyzed today. To me, the more interesting question, and this is where we spent the bulk of our conversation, was on do we need to do more? What's the real value to do more? And how much is good enough and how much is absolutely required. At the conference, the Live 2017 event, one of the keynote speakers said that he espouses all data to be gathered up. So whether there is immediate use for it or not, we need to censor everything. We need to gather up as much data as is available, and we need to collect it and we need to look at it. And there was another gentleman there who said, I think that's a pretty much a waste of time. We've got to be very clinical in the types of data that we gather up and the amount of effort we put in analyzing the data. And my own view is that the truth is somewhere in between. The reason is big data and data analysis has a big component of serendipity built into it, which means that when you think of the two classes of the way you do data analysis, one is I have a question and I know that certain types of data may be helpful in answering that question. And in that case, you obviously have to construct a bunch of sensors which gather up that data. You need to analyze that data, and then you need to be able to create potential answers for that question. In some other cases, you're not even sure what the question is. You're not clear whether I should be asking a particular question and if that question ultimately has consequence, because there is often a cost associated in asking questions and there is a cost associated in answering questions. And unless they have a big impact on the bottom line, you need to focus your attentions. So in that latter category, it's important not to waste your time in gathering up a whole bunch of data which may or may not be relevant. Now, the purist in data science and machine learning will say, gather the data and you'll ultimately build a model. Yes, you can build a model for lots of things, but the real question is that model highly redundant and duplicative, or is that bringing some additional incremental insight, which at the end of the day pays for the effort and, more importantly, improves the outcomes that we are interested in oil and gas.
Nagaraj, also, can you put into context the rate or the speed and velocity of which the data is coming at you and which you have to make decisions upon?
That's actually quite a mixed bag in the oil and gas space. Let's go with a couple of examples. When you think of seismic, when you look at the amount of seismic being shot and the amount of seismic being used for reprocessing to get clear image of the subsurface, obviously by definition, you're talking about gigabytes, terabytes, and often petabytes of data there. That data has to not only be looked at from a streaming perspective, but it also has to be looked at in terms of completeness, which means that it's very hard to create an incremental image of the subsurface, and you need to process pretty much as you can simultaneously. Now, obviously, you can distribute it and you can do a number of intelligent techniques around it, but overall, there's a high degree of associativity of that data. Now, when you think of what the implications of that are over time, when people were shooting just 2D seismic, the amount of data was lower. Now you've got 3D and then 4D seismic. That clearly is increasing the overall volume of data. But now you're getting to a point where the time for discoveries are being forced to shrink from being a year, couple of years, 3 years to much shorter duration, which means that often I want to be able to respond to a licensing round in weeks as opposed to months and quarters. I want to be able to gather up my incremental seismic that's being gathered up in hours as opposed to days, because I want to use that data to inform me about the next well that I drill or plan my next operation for the current well that I am drilling. So when you think of the business imperatives in pushing the velocity of processing of this data and gleaning insights from this data, is getting much more stringent. Now, if you look at another example of real-time drilling, traditionally when you speak of offshore drilling, it's very, very low latency oriented data, and often the bandwidths that you require are quite high because you're streaming and sampling data at a fairly high frequency. Now, when you think of the weakest link in that chain of communication, it's the reliance on potentially uplinks or satellite-based communication. And that's where the advent of the IoT, Industrial Internet of Things, coupled with the big data analysis and streaming and real-time data, is helping better distribute the data gathering and the data analysis between the edge and ultimately the cloud of the data center. The more intelligent balancing of this in terms of processing, synthesizing, and having people augmenting what's going on from a computing perspective is a big breakthrough that's happening in the industry at this point in time. And then finally, of course, when you think of data like production, there's a lot of data that's being gathered up as part of the operations of a well. And when you think of cell phone coverage that's occurring in North America, it's now to a point where you can pretty much wire up any well in North America for at a fairly inexpensive rate. And then the question becomes, what do I do with this data? How does that change my work processes? And how does it change the economic case for drilling, completing, and operating wells in North America, for example?
In the context of this 2015 report, so something that Dan just mentioned, about only 1% of the data that is actually used. And you kind of mentioned about the fact that many a times, you have a hypothesis based on which you go out there and gather data. On the other hand, you might just be collecting the data and then finding patterns within that. So that kind of brings me to the point of having an important data strategy, right?
There's two levels of having a data strategy. And the reason this is critical, especially in the oil and gas industry, is because not only is the data fragmented by discipline and by domain, but also by geographical location. So if you think of a typical well, oil and gas, as all of us know, isn't available in very glamorous places. You find it in the middle of nowhere, and you got to be able to secure the data from those locations. And then you typically have a hub which is gathering up all of the data for analysis across the region, and then you have a corporate entity within an enterprise that's looking at the data across the globe. So when you think of the distribution, the geographical and the time-based distribution of that data, coupled with the fact that it's fragmented between departments and silos and functions, that poses a significant challenge. And one can argue that especially with the state of technologies 15, 20 years ago in terms of computer science, it was very hard to solve that problem in a holistic fashion. Now, with having a very seamless fabric of computing available globally, with the advent of cloud and edge computing and things like that, it's much more attractive and much more feasible to have a sophisticated and a coherent strategy which can be implemented not just from a low TCO perspective, but also from an effectiveness perspective, where each discipline can do their jobs effectively, but they can start looking at the bigger picture to unlock some additional value in the otherwise white spaces that have been left behind. That requires the business leaders as well as people in the IT profession and in the digital world to think through this and have coherent strategy. And I'll use a synonym for that, in which I really like, which is enterprise architecture. And unless you have an enterprise architecture available for that, it's quite difficult to figure out how to attack that problem for immediate business benefit, but also for long-term sustainability.
Okay, Nagaraj, this is Craig Trumpy, and I come from a reliability background. How do you see reliability fitting into how you're architecting this overall data? And what things is Halliburton doing from a reliability perspective? I think this applies primarily to operating the well, but I think it may also apply to the other aspects of drilling and completing.
There are a couple of different aspects of reliability that we think about from a Halliburton perspective. First and foremost is, as you all know, oil and gas and Halliburton is a very asset-intensive business. So we use a lot of assets to deliver our services. And when you think of the kinds of assets we're talking about, things like trucks, pumps, and hydraulic valves and fluid ends and a whole bunch of things like that, and including, wireline tools and drilling tools and so on. So those rotables and expendables all have to be incorporated into that asset value chain, if you will. Maintenance and reliability of those make big impact on the business, because at the end of the day, when anything does not perform per its specification, the non-productive time that results ends up in huge losses for our customers or for ourselves. And the goal of having repeatability and reliability is at the core. So when you think of how modern digital techniques and data-oriented techniques can help in that cause, often it goes to being much more predictive, prescriptive about our maintenance, but also in terms of understanding system reliability. So, for example, we have a very critical piece of equipment in our fracturing process, and we looked at the failure rates of that system as a whole. We essentially decompose that system into individual piece parts and individual subsystems and components and so on. And it turns out that we had a pretty inexpensive part, which was the critical path of failure. So when you looked at system reliability, it was being affected by this one particular expendable. Then we had a process where we added some sensors on that to figure out if we could, from the operating characteristics and parameters that we derived from it, reliably predict when it was near end of life, so we could swap it out and therefore enhance system reliability as a whole. So the advent of inexpensive sensors, the ability to gather the data from those sensors, build a model, a reliability model for that system, figure out when that was being breached, using that as a trigger to replace parts, ended up creating significant savings for us. But more important than the savings was the fact that the system reliability got enhanced, which meant that we were able to provide additional value to our customers in terms of uptime, in terms of the ability to respond to their changing requirements and so on. So that's one example of where asset-based reliability makes a big difference. The second one, which I think is even more important in the oil and gas space and represents real opportunity, is when we think in terms of something we call well integrity. So very often you drill a well over 15, 20, 30 days, depending on the kind of well, and then it operates for 30, 40, 50 years. And there's a trade-off between the quality of the initial well that you produce with the longevity of the well and the amount of rework or the workovers intervention that you have to do on that well. And that is determined by the integrity of the well. And being able to formulate that integrity, which is not being done for the majority of the wells in the world, that's something that requires data. So unless you have the data, and it probably goes back to the previous question that was being asked around data strategy, unless you have a real strategy around the data that quantifies the integrity of the well, and then use that to drive the investments in upkeep of the well so that you maximize the productivity, the reservoir contact, the reservoir integrity, that's something which is going to undermine the initial investment and affect the payback of the well and ultimately the field in a big way. Two examples, Craig, if that makes sense.
As a follow-on to that, one of the things that Dan and I have been involved in quite a bit is conversations around, is the OEM data that you have today, is that enough data? And you touched on that a little bit, suggesting that you added sensors to help you predict the end of life of some machinery, I suppose. Do you want to just elaborate a little bit on your thoughts around is there enough data and how do you add those sensors? And
when you go to the individual components, so when you look at fans and turbines and blades and some basic building blocks, I think the closer you can get to an OEM's specifications and use generic models and there's enough data around it. But the more and more you start looking at higher level systems, that's where I think the reliability science and reliability engineering and that formalism associated with it on how you take failure rates from the lowest levels and then cascading them up, because it's, as you all know, that's not linear and that's not additive. Something that has to be understood a lot more, which means looking at failure distributions of the individual piece parts and then looking at systems of systems, aggregating in some sense what the overall failure and the reliability is. That requires a lot more specificity in terms of the systems that individuals are putting together, more importantly, how they're operating it under and how it's interacting with the surrounding ecosystem. So when you think of a tool in drilling, the way it interacts with the harsh subsurface environment is going to be quite different from using a drill bit or some other kind of an equivalent tool in another environment where it's a very different operating set of conditions. So I think there's a lot of data and a lot of models and a lot of inferences that you can draw from general purpose existing data. But in many cases in our industry and in the circumstances we are in, there's enough specificity that is worthwhile investing in additional sensoring, gathering additional operating parameters, and then leveraging that to build out these models. So a classic example is electrical submersible pumps. So when you think of ESPs in general, this has been a problem that has been studied for a very, very long time. And people have done a good job in terms of getting overall reliability. But when you're looking for that next step change in overall uptime of the overall asset, you got to look at much more of the subsurface parameters, much more of the environment in which it's operating and how those interact. And when you look at that in its totality, you're able to get, 10, 20, 30% extra capability, and you're able to get some additional efficiencies, which then goes a long way in changing the economics of production.
I come at this from a data science or a big data background, and just within data science, specifically with the recent advancement in machine learning and specifically with deep learning, how do you see it has impacted the recent advancement in deep learning? How has that impacted the oil and gas business today?
I think it's done two things, quite honestly. Needless to say, it's added a significant amount of value. Where when you look at traditionally, the way it has worked is you have a large amount of data, you have a physicist or an equivalent scientist who looks at the data and then conceives of and spends a lot of time on the physics of the problem, and they construct physical models. Then you have to test it out and see if it works and so on. Now, clearly, deep learning and those kinds of techniques, you kind of invert that process and look to the data to fit a model and create a model, and you use a model to explain a certain phenomena. And that process by itself is hugely empowering. It speeds up the process of unlocking some insights from the data. Now, at the same time, I think that you've got to appreciate and respect the limits of that, because what we find is in many of the cases in greenfield territory, we are able to get to models which are explained, 60%, 70% confidence, but then that's not good enough from an overall utilization standpoint, from an efficacy perspective. And what you do need is subject matter expertise to interact with that data scientist, with the data science principles, to enhance that from a 70-80% up to a point of practical use. Therefore, are much more bullish about thinking of data science as yet another tool in the toolkit or yet another arrow in the quiver. And when you put that in conjunction with some of the physical models that have been developed in the industry over a long time, they together serve as inherent workhorses which can really create a huge opportunities and bridge some of the gaps that have existed traditionally in the industry. Does that fit your worldview?
For sure, it does. It just gets exciting with GPU processing power, and then being able to grok on audio and seismic data along with operational data to maybe get some of that new complex nuance that can take the industry one step further. One aspect you mentioned, Nagaraj, was subject matter expertise, and this is where we see a lot of issues associated where, I always see oil and gas at the forefront. I mean, I don't know if it's the storied history of having to get this stuff out of the ground and it's a can-do attitude. It's pushing the boundaries, and we can't just machine learn without subject matter expertise. To me, it's the blend of subject matter expertise and data science, to Gronk on weights and variables and such. But also one thing that I'd like you to comment on is how do you deliver this technology? Streaming analytics, deep learning, integration into workflow such that it's valuable and can be actioned upon. These old professionals aren't necessarily data analysts. So what's your take on that, and how do you approach it?
So that's probably one of the most fundamental questions that we have to answer in every field, but especially in the oil and gas sector, because if you think about the way our workforce is distributed, I'll say probably 80-85% of our workforce is in the field, and they are not experts in machine learning, and by no stretch of imaginations are they going to get that. So if you need to explain to them the glories of deep learning and things like that, you lost them. So it's really got to be applying those techniques in very, very consumable chunks, and very often in a transparent fashion. So, for example, the case where we put some sensors on this piece of equipment, most of the people in the field did not know we had done it. So it was just automatically they turned on the equipment as they would do any other piece. They realized that some additional data was being gathered, and very often they did not. Ultimately, the only change they saw was a blinking light. And the instruction was, when this light blinks, you got to go off and replace this part. Or even better, the guy in the field did not need to know that, and the next time the piece of equipment was in the machine shop or in the warehouse, somebody just realized that it was past due, and they changed it over. So the best technology is the one that people don't know about. That's the aphorism that we try to live by. But then there's a certain class of individuals within the oil and gas companies and within our own company, which are much more of they are the people that are creating. Whether they're creating solutions or products or tools or capabilities, that's something that they're doing extensively, and they've got to have visibility to many of these techniques and technologies and the underlying data. They've got to be much more of an expert in these types of things, but also in how to work together in teams. So the way we have structured our data science team is to really co-locate them with SMEs. But at the same time, we try to encourage them to start working on problems with no context. So a recent example, there was a particular problem with relating to drill bits that the data science person that we had working on it had a PhD, a dual PhD in computational chemistry and subatomic physics. So this person came together not knowing what a drill bit. So the first question this lady asked was, what is a drill bit and what does it do? And that was kind of stunning to most people working with her. But in a couple of months, she had formed a model. And the way she went about doing it was first looked at the data, understood what the data was suggesting, inferred what the process was that was generating that data. Then when the person was fairly done with an exhaustive view of the data, sat with the SME, understood how this was working, what the exact field of use was, and then they unlearned some of the faulty assumptions that they had made and reinforced some of the things that the data was suggesting. So when you think of the personality of the person that is dealing with that, it requires a level of curiosity, a level of openness that allows them to revisit certain assumptions that they have made, and the ability to synthesize multiple points of view. And ultimately, we think that the most productive combination of data scientists and SME is when that kind of a thing happens in full power.
Yeah, that's a great example, Nagaraj, of having an expert in one particular field, such as a data scientist, working in a different vertical, right, in one particular domain. And, we often talk about spending a lot of upfront time in getting familiar with that domain, business understanding. And if you understand the business process, only then would you be able to make sense out of the data. I would like to ask you a question about the Open Earth platform that you had briefly mentioned about at the Life 2017 conference as well.
Open Earth community is really an effort of like-minded people in the oil and gas sector to try and speed up the pace of innovation and lower the cost of innovation. So when you think about the way most of the software or the applications that operators and software providers and others have produced, it's been historically one where you need the fixed cost of all of the commodity components of building out. So whether it is all of the data structures, the database, the data models that are required to model E&P and oil and gas in general, and all of the tooling associated with it, and very often the algorithms, which are really the secret sauce and the core IP of any of the company, that's often the minority. But yet, each of the companies end up spending a lot of time duplicating what is essentially a commodity. And when you think of it, the core around it has been, and the result of that has been that you're locking in your investment and you're not able to deploy that locked capital into future innovation. When you think of the alternative to that, it's one where everybody uses something which is fairly set of common tooling and common frameworks and so on. But that's a problem because inherently nobody wants to be dependent on anybody else. Nobody wants to slow down for somebody else, and you often think you don't want to necessarily share. And this is where we took a page out of the open source community, where there's a lot of innovation, there's a lot of eyeballs that are brought to bear, a lot of intellect that's being brought to bear. But at the same time, you're nurturing and allowing for improvisation. You're allowing for creativity. And the Open Earth community is just an effort to bring that same kind of a spirit to oil and gas with the sensibilities of oil and gas, which means that the people dealing with that and optimizing for it understand what seismic means. They understand what a well means, and they're not working at the basic computer science tooling because that's available in plenty on the West Coast or globally, I should say, where you're able to pull off multiple frameworks and multiple big data blueprints and so on. So what we did was essentially pull together a series of players, operators, of horizontal providers, of data providers, of other software ISVs in this space. And all of us have gotten together and basically come up with a community-minded way of contributing, sharing, and leveraging off of each other's innovation.
As we come to the close of this conversation, where do you see AI, machine learning, and IoT transforming the business, mainly the gas and oil business, in the future? So we've talked about how things were in the past, how things have changed in recent times. But looking ahead with your lens, how do you see the business being impacted further?
I think there are probably going to be 2 or 3 fundamental transformations that happen, and I'll use the metrics that I see will be affected. So if you think about exploration success, it's between 30 and 40%, which means for every 100 prospects that I look at, probably fail more than 50% of the time. And I think that is going to fundamentally change because of AI. You're going to be able to look at the data and, more importantly, fill the gaps that previously were unable to be filled. And that's going to be a step change. That means in success rates and success ratios, they are going to be fundamentally altered. The second one is in terms of cost per barrel. So when you think of whether the finding of the lifting cost per BOE, it's going to be fundamentally altered by virtue of sensoring and ML and IoT and things of that nature, because it's going to allow us to embark on a very different trajectory of continuous improvement on the one hand, and second is you're going to be able to do things that you previously just could not have done. And so that's going to be the real important second metric. And between these two, I think there is, when you look back 5 years from now, I think this is going to be a very, very significant enabler or a contributor to that step change.
That was a great conversation, Nagaraj. We want to thank you for your time.
Yeah, Nagaraj, thanks a lot.
Thanks, Dan. Thanks, Manjeet. Thanks, Craig. Thank you. Appreciate it. Enjoyed it.
Yeah, we did too.